Leave now! You are not cleared for this aircraft.
My assignment was already confirmed.
Then someone made a mistake.
Falcon One, confirm your assigned captain is standing by. Falcon One, that's what I asked you to verify.
Leave now. The words landed harder than the closing hangar door behind them. Captain Marcus Ellison stood beside the executive jet, parked at a private aviation terminal outside Atlanta, one hand resting on his flight case, the other holding a laminated operations packet he had reviewed 3 times before arrival. At 52, Marcus had learned that confidence did not need volume. His uniform was pressed, his silver-trimmed wings were polished, and his calm expression rarely changed, even when someone expected him to prove he belonged. The woman standing across from him expected exactly that. Victoria Hale, the CEO of a fast-growing aerospace investment firm, looked at the badge clipped near his chest and then back at his face. She was not shouting. That was what made the moment more difficult. Her tone carried the controlled certainty of someone used to decisions becoming reality. "I said remove yourself from this aircraft," she repeated. "This flight is for authorized personnel only." Marcus glanced at the boarding manifest on his tablet. Captain Marcus Ellison, scheduled pilot for Hale Aviation Services, Flight 418. My authorization was confirmed yesterday by dispatch. Victoria folded her arms. Dispatch can make mistakes. Behind her, 2 ground employees slowed their work. One of them, Daniel Brooks, a 29-year-old maintenance technician, stopped near the luggage cart without pretending not to listen. He had seen enough airport conflicts to know when a conversation was no longer about a simple misunderstanding. Marcus did not move. "Before anyone removes anyone," he said quietly, "we should verify the flight documentation." Victoria looked toward the terminal entrance. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be." That sentence stayed with Daniel, not because it was unusual, because he had heard versions of it before. The person being questioned was always asked to make the situation easier by accepting the assumption placed on them. Marcus opened the operations packet. The aircraft is assigned. The crew authorization is active. The safety briefing was completed. Victoria stepped closer and lowered her voice. "Captain, I do not know who gave you permission to act like you run this operation, but you need to understand your position." Marcus looked at the aircraft behind her. The Gulfstream's polished exterior reflected the morning light, but his attention remained on the paperwork. "My position," he answered, "is the person responsible for getting everyone safely there." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Victoria made a decision. She turned toward the terminal supervisor and said, "Call security. This pilot is refusing to leave." Daniel noticed something important. She never asked whether Marcus was actually authorized. She had already decided what the problem was. The terminal supervisor, Elena Ruiz, a 40-year-old operations coordinator, approached with hesitation. She checked the manifest, then looked at Marcus's credentials. "I'll need a minute to verify this," Elena said. Victoria sighed. "There is nothing to verify." But Elena had already picked up the radio. Inside the cockpit access area, a small communication panel remained active. A routine systems check was still connected with air traffic control because the aircraft was preparing for departure. The radio crackled. "Falcon One, Atlanta Center. Confirm your crew status." Everyone near the aircraft stopped. Daniel looked at Marcus. Victoria looked at Elena. The voice from the tower repeated, "Falcon One, confirm you have Captain Ellison on board and ready for departure." Marcus reached for the headset, but he did not speak immediately. Because the most important moment was not that someone finally recognized him. It was that they had ignored the evidence sitting in front of them before they heard his name. And now the entire situation had changed. Elena's expression changed as she studied the manifest again. The document had never been unclear. The assumption had been. Victoria's confidence began to collide with a fact she could no longer dismiss. The person she tried to remove was the one the entire operation had been waiting for. The radio remained silent for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was not a long time in aviation. But in that moment, it felt like everyone standing beside the aircraft was waiting for the same thing. Whether Marcus Ellison would defend himself or whether he would let the facts do it. He lifted the headset. "Atlanta Center, Falcon One. Captain Ellison confirming crew status. We are holding position pending ground clarification. The response came immediately. Copy, Falcon One. We show you as authorized command crew. Advise if assistance is required. Marcus released the transmit button. He did not look at Victoria. That bothered her more than an argument would have. Victoria had spent 15 years building a reputation around decisiveness. She was known for walking into failing companies, cutting waste, and forcing executives to confront uncomfortable numbers. In boardrooms, people called it leadership. She had built her identity around seeing problems before anyone else did. But now, standing beside an aircraft she owned through her investment group, she faced a different kind of mistake. She had seen a problem because she expected one. I was not informed that the assigned captain would be. Victoria stopped herself. Elena Ruiz noticed the unfinished sentence. Would be what? Victoria looked at her. The question was simple, but it exposed something Victoria did not want to say out loud. Marcus closed the operations packet. This is not about my qualifications anymore. Those were available before anyone asked me to leave. Daniel, still standing near the luggage cart, looked down at the maintenance checklist in his hand. He remembered Marcus arriving 30 minutes earlier. The captain had greeted every worker by name. He had asked about a small hydraulic inspection issue before checking his own flight paperwork. Daniel had assumed Marcus was a senior pilot. He had not assumed anything else. Elena stepped closer to the tablet Marcus held. Can I see the authorization record? Marcus handed it over. She reviewed the digital entry carefully. The approval timestamp, aircraft assignment, and crew release were all there. Then Elena noticed something else. The original flight notes had been updated at 6:12 that morning. The update was not from Marcus. It was from Victoria's executive office. Elena? Victoria asked. The hesitation in Elena's face answered before her words did. What? Victoria said. Elena turned the screen slightly. There was a request to review the crew assignment this morning. Victoria frowned. Yes, because I wanted confirmation. But the confirmation was already completed. Elena said, I asked for a second review. A second review is fine, Elena replied, but the note attached to the request says the concern was that the assigned captain was not the expected profile. The air around them changed. Daniel looked up. Marcus remained still. Victoria's expression hardened. That wording was taken out of context. Elena did not argue. Maybe, but it triggered a manual review. That sentence mattered. Because Marcus understood something immediately. The issue was no longer whether Victoria personally disliked him. The issue was whether a private assumption had entered an operational process that affected a safety-critical role. And that was a line Marcus could not ignore. I need this documented, he said. Victoria looked surprised. You want to file a complaint against me? No, Marcus answered. I want the process documented correctly. His calm response created a problem for her. Anger would have been easier to dismiss. A calm request for accountability was harder. The terminal supervisor arrived with a security officer, but Elena raised a hand before they approached. There is no security issue, she said. There is an authorization verification issue. Marcus watched Victoria carefully. For the first time that morning, she was not looking at him like an obstacle. She was looking at him like a person whose patience had a boundary, and that boundary had finally been reached. Elena saved the review notes and forwarded them through the proper operations channel. The flight was no longer simply delayed. A formal question had entered the system. Who had actually created the problem? The captain standing beside the aircraft, or the assumption that tried to remove him? Marcus had spent enough years in aviation to know that the most dangerous moments were not always the loud ones. Sometimes danger arrived quietly. A wrong assumption entered a report. A shortcut became a habit. A person with authority accepted the first explanation because it matched what they already believed. That was why Marcus did not celebrate when Elena preserved the review notes. The situation had changed, but it had not been resolved. Inside the terminal office, Elena sat across from Marcus with the flight documentation open on her screen. Victoria stood near the window, looking out at the runway where aircraft moved with precise purpose. I want to make something clear, Victoria said. I requested verification because I have a responsibility to protect company assets. Marcus nodded once. That responsibility matters. The agreement surprised her. But protection cannot begin with assuming the wrong person is the risk, he continued. Victoria turned around. For the first time, her expression showed uncertainty instead of control. I did not say you were a risk. You didn't have to, Marcus replied. The room became quiet. Elena watched both of them carefully. She had handled executive disagreements before. Most ended with someone trying to win the room. Marcus was doing something different. He was trying to establish what happened. That difference mattered. A few minutes later, the company's flight operations director, Samuel Carter, joined the call. He was a 48-year-old former military aviation officer responsible for compliance and crew standards. "Walk me through exactly what happened," Samuel said. Victoria immediately began. "I arrived for my scheduled flight review. I saw an individual near my aircraft claiming to be the captain. I requested confirmation." Samuel looked at the screen, and after confirmation, Victoria paused. "I requested additional verification." "Why?" "Because the situation seemed unusual." Samuel did not answer immediately. "What specifically seemed unusual?" he asked. Victoria crossed her arms. "I was not expecting this person to be assigned." Samuel looked down at the records. The words were professional. The sequence was not. He saw that the crew authorization existed before Victoria arrived. He saw that dispatch had confirmed Marcus hours earlier. He saw that the review request came only after Victoria personally encountered him. "Captain Ellison," Samuel said, "did you provide your credentials when asked?" "Yes." "Did you refuse any instruction?" "No. I requested the verification process." Samuel nodded. That answer mattered because it removed the argument that Marcus had been difficult or uncooperative. The first version of the story was changing. Daniel, the maintenance technician, was asked to provide a statement because he had witnessed the interaction outside the aircraft. He hesitated. "I'm not trying to get involved," Daniel said. Marcus looked at him. "You are not causing trouble by describing what happened." Daniel took a breath. "I saw Captain Ellison arrive. He checked the aircraft records before boarding. He spoke respectfully. The first time I heard anyone question his assignment was after Ms. Hale arrived." Victoria looked toward him. "Are you saying I did something wrong?" Daniel swallowed. "I'm saying what I saw." That answer carried more weight than an accusation, because it was not revenge. It was observation. Samuel ended the call after collecting the statements, but before leaving he gave one instruction. "Do not release this aircraft until operations completes the review." Victoria looked frustrated. "The flight is being delayed because of this?" Samuel answered carefully. "The flight is being delayed because the review process must be completed correctly." Marcus gathered his flight documents. He had wanted to fly that morning. He had prepared for the route, reviewed weather patterns, and checked every operational detail. But now another responsibility had appeared. Not as a pilot, as a professional who understood that small failures in judgment could become larger failures in systems. Outside, the aircraft waited under the morning sun, and somewhere inside the company records, a simple question was being written down. Why had a qualified captain needed to prove he belonged before anyone checked whether he already did? Marcus returned to the cockpit 30 minutes later, but he did not start the engines. The aircraft was ready. The weather window was still open. The passengers waiting inside the private terminal had not been told the full reason for the delay. They only knew that the departure time had moved and that operations was conducting a review. Marcus sat in the captain's seat and looked over the instrument panel. Thousands of hours of flying had taught him that machines were often easier to understand than people. A warning light meant something specific. A system alert had a procedure. A checklist had a purpose. Human judgment was harder, because people could convince themselves they were being careful while still making decisions based on assumptions. His phone vibrated. It was a message from his sister Lauren. "Heard your flight was delayed. Everything okay?" Marcus stared at the screen for a moment before replying. "Operational review. Nothing unsafe. Just complicated." A few seconds later, another message appeared. Complicated usually means someone made it personal. Marcus smiled slightly. Lauren had known him long enough to recognize the difference between inconvenience and injustice. She also knew his habit of carrying problems alone because he believed professionalism meant absorbing pressure without complaint. He put the phone away. That was the habit he was beginning to question. Not because he wanted attention, because silence could sometimes protect the wrong person. Outside the cockpit window, Elena approached the aircraft carrying a folder. Marcus opened the door. "Any updates?" Elena handed him the folder. The company completed the first review. Marcus opened it. Inside was the preliminary operations report. It did not accuse Victoria of intentional discrimination. It did not make claims they could not prove. Instead, it documented the sequence of events. Crew authorization confirmed. Captain credentials verified. Executive request submitted after visual identification. Additional review initiated without operational basis. Marcus read the final line carefully. Recommendation: conduct leadership review regarding bias indicators in crew verification procedures. He looked up. This is unusual. Elena nodded. It is. Most organizations avoid wording like this. They usually do, she said. What changed? Elena glanced toward the terminal building. The fact that the process itself showed what happened. That sentence stayed with Marcus. The strongest evidence was not a dramatic accusation. It was the timeline, the order of events, the difference between what people claimed happened and what actually happened. Before Marcus could respond, Victoria walked toward the aircraft. Her confidence had returned slightly, but something else had replaced it. Defensiveness. Captain Ellison. Marcus stepped down from the cockpit. Yes, I reviewed the report. And? Victoria looked uncomfortable. I believe the situation was misunderstood. Marcus waited. She expected him to argue. He didn't. That forced her to continue. I was trying to make sure the aircraft was being handled properly. Marcus nodded. That is a reasonable responsibility. Victoria seemed relieved for a moment. Then he added, but a reasonable responsibility does not make every decision reasonable. Her expression tightened. I have built this company by making difficult calls. And aviation is built by verifying difficult calls, Marcus replied. The difference between the two statements was the difference between leadership and control. Victoria looked away. For the first time, Marcus saw something beneath the executive confidence. Fear. Not fear of him. Fear of what the record might reveal about a pattern she had never examined. I don't want this to become a public issue, she said. Marcus looked toward the runway. I don't either. That answer surprised her. But preventing embarrassment cannot be the reason we avoid fixing something. The silence afterward was heavier than any argument, because both of them understood the same thing. The problem was no longer whether Marcus Ellison belonged in the cockpit. The system had already answered that. The harder question was whether the company was willing to examine why it had questioned him before it checked. And that question was now moving beyond one delayed flight. The flight eventually departed 3 hours behind schedule. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like a simple delay. A private aircraft had left late. An executive meeting had been moved. A routine review had taken longer than expected. But Marcus Ellison knew better. Some events only looked small because the people affected had learned how to carry them quietly. During the flight, Marcus followed every procedure exactly as he always had. He reviewed weather updates, communicated with air traffic control, and guided the aircraft through the route with the same discipline he had shown for more than 25 years. The passengers never saw the conversation that happened before takeoff. They never saw the moment when a question about his qualifications became a question about the company's culture. And Marcus preferred it that way. He had never wanted to become a symbol. He wanted people to understand that he was a professional. 3 days later, the internal review expanded. Not because Marcus demanded it, because the records revealed something unexpected. The operations team analyzed 12 previous crew verification requests involving executive flights over the past year. The review was not looking for discrimination at first. It was looking for consistency. But patterns rarely announce themselves. They appear through repetition. Elena Ruiz presented the findings during a compliance meeting. There were 4 cases where additional verification was requested after an executive personally questioned an assigned crew member, she explained. Samuel Carter looked through the documents. Were those requests against policy? No, Elena replied. The policy allows verification. Then what is the concern? Elena turned the page. The concern is who gets questioned, when they get questioned, and what assumptions trigger the request. The room became quiet. Victoria sat at the end of the table. She had expected an investigation about one incident. Instead, she was looking at a mirror, not a dramatic accusation, not a public attack, a process showing where human judgment had entered a system designed to rely on standards. Marcus attended the meeting but remained quiet for most of it. That bothered some people. They expected him to describe how embarrassed he felt. They expected anger. They expected a speech about respect. Instead, he focused on something else. How do we make sure the next captain doesn't have to spend 40 minutes proving something the system already knows? That question changed the direction of the conversation, because it moved the discussion away from Marcus personally. It forced everyone to consider the structure. Samuel proposed 3 changes. First, executive requests for crew verification would require documented operational reasons. Second, all verification events would be reviewed independently from the person requesting them. Third, captains and crew members would have a formal channel to report concerns without fear of damaging professional relationships. Victoria listened without interrupting. But after the meeting ended, she asked Marcus to stay. "I want to understand something," she said. Marcus waited. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" The question was honest, and that made the answer more important. "Because it shouldn't have mattered." Victoria looked down. "You could have ended the situation immediately." "Yes, then why didn't you?" Marcus took a moment. "Because if the only reason someone changes their decision is because they discover my position, then the problem was never my position." The words stayed between them. Victoria had spent years measuring people by outcomes, revenue, growth, performance. But she was beginning to understand another measurement: how people were treated before anyone knew what they could provide. "I owe you an apology," she said. Marcus nodded slowly. "I appreciate that." Victoria looked surprised. "That's all?" "No." Marcus looked toward the conference room window. "An apology matters when it changes what happens next." That was the difference between forgiveness and repair. One was a feeling. The other required action. Outside the building, the aircraft that had started the conflict sat quietly on the runway. The same aircraft. The same company. But now a question had moved through the organization. Not who was qualified to fly. That had never been unclear. The question was whether leadership could recognize a qualified person before it was forced to. The changes did not happen overnight. Marcus knew better than most people that procedures written on paper were only the beginning. A policy could sit inside a company handbook for years and still fail if nobody followed the spirit behind it. That was why he paid attention to what happened after the meeting. The first visible change came 2 weeks later. Elena invited Marcus back to the operations center to observe the new verification process. The room looked the same. The same screens displayed flight schedules. The same radios carried voices from different parts of the aviation system. But the language had changed. Instead of asking why someone seemed unusual, the new review form required specific operational concerns: credential issue, documentation mismatch, safety requirement, regulatory question. Every concern needed a reason. Every reason needed a record. It was not a perfect solution. Marcus knew that. No form could remove every assumption a person carried into a room. But a strong process could slow down the moment when an assumption became a decision. Daniel Brooks, the maintenance technician who had witnessed the original confrontation, was also there. "You know what's strange?" Daniel said while checking equipment nearby. Marcus smiled. "What?" "I thought the biggest change would be someone getting punished." Marcus looked at him. Daniel shrugged. But it wasn't. The biggest change was everyone having to explain themselves. That observation stayed with Marcus. Accountability was not always about one person losing power. Sometimes it was about creating a system where power had to answer questions. Later that afternoon, Victoria requested a private meeting. Marcus almost declined. Not because he was angry, because he had learned that some conversations only happened after the damage was already visible. Still, he agreed. They met in a small conference room overlooking the runway. "I wanted to tell you something before it becomes part of a formal announcement," Victoria said. Marcus waited. "I'm stepping back from direct approval of flight operations decisions." He studied her expression. "Is that your choice?" "Yes." "Why?" Victoria looked toward the aircraft outside. "Because I realized I was confusing access with understanding." Marcus said nothing. She continued. "I built a company by trusting my instincts. That helped me in some situations. But instincts are dangerous when they are never challenged." That was not the kind of apology most people expected from someone in her position. There was no dramatic confession, no attempt to rewrite what happened, just an uncomfortable acknowledgement. Marcus appreciated that. But he also understood something else. Recognition after accountability was different from recognition before it. "Changing the structure helps," Marcus said. "But people will still have moments where they have to choose what they believe." Victoria nodded. "I know." The following month, the company announced a new aviation leadership review program. It included training for executives, independent review of crew concerns, and a requirement that operational decisions be separated from personal assumptions. The announcement did not mention Marcus by name. He preferred it that way. The point was never to make one person famous for surviving a moment that should not have happened. The point was to make the moment less likely to happen again. On a quiet morning several weeks later, Marcus arrived at the airport before sunrise. The runway lights reflected against the dark pavement. He walked toward his aircraft, carrying the same flight case he had carried thousands of times before. Nothing about the case had changed. Nothing about the aircraft had changed. But the people around it had. A younger pilot approached him near the hangar. "Captain Ellison?" Marcus turned. "Yes, I heard about the new verification system." Marcus nodded. The pilot smiled. "Good change." Marcus looked at the aircraft waiting ahead. "Yes," he said, "it is." Then he continued walking. Because the work had never been about proving he belonged. He had belonged the entire time. The real work was making sure the next person would not have to prove it first. Months later, during a routine flight, the same tower frequency came alive. Falcon One, Atlanta Center. Clear for departure. Marcus adjusted the headset. Falcon One ready. The call was ordinary. The flight was ordinary. And that was exactly the outcome he wanted. Because progress was not always a dramatic victory witnessed by everyone. Sometimes progress was when a person entered a room and the first question was no longer whether they belonged there. It was simply, what needs to be done? The call from Atlanta Center became familiar again. That was the strange thing about healing. The world rarely announced that something had changed. There was no moment when the airport lights turned brighter, or the runway became a symbol of victory. There was only the quiet return of ordinary routines. For Marcus Ellison, ordinary had always been the goal. But not everyone at Hale Aviation had moved on as easily. 3 months after the incident, Elena Ruiz noticed a problem during a routine compliance review. The new verification process was working, but one department had started finding ways around it. Not by breaking the rules, by avoiding them. Several executive assistants had begun calling operations directly instead of submitting formal requests. They described concerns vaguely, hoping someone would take a closer look without creating a documented review. Elena recognized the pattern immediately. A system could be changed on paper while old habits survived underneath. She brought this issue to Samuel Carter. "We fixed the door," she said. "But people are still looking for windows." Samuel nodded. "That means the process is being tested." The information eventually reached Marcus. He was not surprised. During his career, he had seen organizations react strongly after a crisis and slowly return to old habits once attention disappeared. The hardest part of change was not admitting something went wrong. It was continuing to act differently when nobody was watching. Marcus agreed to participate in a leadership workshop the company created for executives and flight operations staff. He almost refused at first. He did not want to become the person permanently attached to one difficult moment. But Elena convinced him. "This is not about telling your story," she said. "It is about teaching people how decisions happen before they become consequences." So Marcus stood in front of a room filled with pilots, managers, and executives. He did not give a speech about being mistreated. He showed them a timeline: arrival, verification, assumption, escalation, review, correction. He asked one question: at what point could this situation have ended differently? People offered answers. When credentials were checked, when someone asked a neutral question, when the first assumption was challenged. Marcus nodded. All true. Then he added, "But the earliest moment was before any of that." The room became quiet. The earliest moment was when someone decided what they were looking at before they decided what they needed to know. The workshop was not recorded. There were no cameras, no public announcement, and Marcus preferred it that way. Real change, he believed, was often built in rooms where nobody was trying to impress an audience. Afterward, Victoria approached him. She had changed too, though not in the dramatic way people expected. She was still demanding, still direct, still someone who challenged people in meetings. But now she asked different questions, questions that slowed decisions down before they became irreversible. "I used to think hesitation was weakness," she told Marcus. "And now I think there is a difference between hesitation and verification." Marcus smiled. "That difference matters." Victoria looked toward the workshop room. "I know what people will say about me." Marcus understood. Some mistakes followed people longer than others. "You cannot control every opinion," he said. "No, but you can control what you do next." Victoria nodded. That was the part many people misunderstood about accountability. It was not a single moment. It was a series of choices after the moment. A year after the original flight delay, Marcus walked through the same private terminal where everything had started. The same hallway, the same windows overlooking the runway, the same early morning silence. But this time, a new pilot approached him. "Captain Ellison?" Marcus turned. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" The young pilot looked around before answering. "When I joined this company, I thought I had to prove I deserved to be here before anyone would trust me." Marcus studied him carefully. "And now?" The pilot smiled. "Now I think the work should prove itself first." Marcus nodded. That answer mattered more than any award or announcement. Because the purpose of a corrected system was not to celebrate the person who survived it. It was to reduce the number of people who needed to survive it at all. The aircraft outside prepared for departure. The tower frequency came alive. Falcon One clearance confirmed. Marcus placed the headset on. Falcon One ready. The words were simple, routine, exactly as they should have been. But somewhere between the first time he heard that call and this moment, the meaning had changed. Not because the world finally discovered who Marcus Ellison was, because the world had finally learned that it should have asked before assuming. The following months did not erase what happened. Marcus never expected them to. Some experiences did not disappear simply because a policy changed or a meeting ended. They became part of a person's understanding of the world. They changed how someone walked into a room, how quickly they trusted a process, and how carefully they watched the moments before a decision was made. But Marcus also knew something else. A wound could remain without controlling the future. 1 year after the airport incident, Hale Aviation held its annual safety and leadership review. The event was not glamorous. There were no cameras waiting outside, no reporters looking for a dramatic statement. It was held in a conference room filled with pilots, operations staff, maintenance teams, and executives. The people who kept the company moving. Marcus sat near the back. He had originally planned to attend only as an observer, but when the final agenda item appeared, Samuel Carter asked him to speak. Marcus stood in front of the room. "I want to talk about something we often misunderstand," he began. Everyone listened. "We talk about safety as if it only exists in equipment. Engines, instruments, procedures." He paused. But safety also exists in judgment. Nobody moved. Every flight depends on people making decisions, and every decision depends on what information we accept, what assumptions we challenge, and whether we are willing to slow down when something feels uncertain. He did not mention Victoria. He did not mention the day he was ordered away from his own aircraft. He did not need to. Everyone in the room knew the story. The difference was that the story no longer belonged only to him. It belonged to the organization. After the meeting, Marcus walked outside toward the runway. The afternoon air was warm, and aircraft moved across the field with practiced precision. Victoria joined him a few minutes later. "You know," she said, "a year ago, I thought the biggest mistake was that I questioned you." Marcus looked at her. "And now?" She watched a plane lifting into the sky. "Now I think the bigger mistake was believing I already knew the answer before asking the question." Marcus nodded. That realization was probably the hardest one for any leader to accept. Not that they could be wrong. Everyone knew that. The harder truth was that authority often made it easier to avoid discovering when they were wrong. Victoria handed him a small envelope. Marcus looked at it but did not open it. "What is this?" "A letter from the company's board." He raised an eyebrow. "They wanted to recognize your contribution to the new aviation standards." Marcus smiled slightly. "I don't need a letter for doing my job. I know." Victoria looked at him. But sometimes people deserve to know that their choices mattered. Marcus accepted the envelope. Not because he needed recognition, because he understood that acknowledgement was also part of repair. Later that evening, he opened the letter alone. It did not describe him as a victim. It did not describe him as a hero. It described him as a professional who insisted that standards should apply before assumptions. That was the part he kept, not the praise, the principle. Several weeks later, Marcus received a call from Elena. A new aviation company had contacted Hale Aviation after hearing about their updated verification program. They wanted guidance creating their own system. "They asked if we could share what we learned," Elena said. Marcus looked out his office window. "Are they asking about the incident?" Yes, he thought about that. The original moment had started with someone deciding who he was before checking the facts. Now, the aftermath was creating opportunities for others to check the facts sooner. "Tell them we can help," Marcus said. After the call ended, he returned to his flight preparation. The checklist waited. The weather report was open. The route was ready. The work continued. Because in the end, Marcus Ellison's greatest victory was not that someone finally recognized him as Falcon One. It was that a system learned to respect the person in the cockpit before the radio ever said his name. And somewhere above the runway, as another aircraft prepared for departure, the tower voice came through once again. "Falcon One, cleared for takeoff." Marcus placed the headset over his ears. Falcon One departing. The aircraft moved forward, not with anger, not with revenge, with purpose, and that was enough.